In this video, I'm going to discuss how important emotion is when it comes to composing your backgrounds. There's a huge amount of theory when it comes to illustration and composition, as well as the practical applications of drawing backgrounds. But I think one of the things that's easy to overlook, both in its importance and its practicality to allowing you to make really good decisions and again, really help you in the beginning as an artist to figure out what you should draw in the background is the idea of emotions. What is the point of the story and how can you use that to be a little hack to make things a lot easier and more effective at every stage of your artistic journey? Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you want to learn more about illustration or picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. This charts my journey, going from someone who, really wasn't that good at drawing or art to becoming a professional artist, being published. I discuss topics such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to think about composition, creating thumbnails for your scenes, as well as a few ideas surrounding how to think about getting professional work. It's free and the link will be in the description, so if that's something you're interested in, go check it out. So, thinking about the narrative and how this relates to our process, how we, get from having a vague idea of the scene that we want to create to having a good plan. And again, all the things that we can do to reinforce that idea as we progress the illustration to its finish. I think this is really, really key. And it's something that, again, I feel like I fell afoul of early on because there's so many of these rules, as I was saying, where you have to think about this compositional rule, what's correct, what's not correct. And again, I feel like it's so easy when we're doing illustration to bend a lot of these rules. There's a million different ways that we could create our illustration. We can put anything in the background. And I think feeling this power is really important as artists. It's one of the things that really separates, especially the line and color illustration, but, more stylized picture making from other arts is that we can kind of do whatever we want. And I think the thing that really switched for me was understanding how important the narrative was in that process. And the more I kind of used this both to make my life easier, because I knew that, if I was serving the story, even if the composition maybe wasn't ticking a whole bunch of boxes, right? It wasn't always looking, the most epic or that it would still be okay because the story comes first. And that's certainly what I found to be the most powerful thing. But again, it's also important to understand that depending on what type of art you're doing, you want to think about and use composition differently. The story and the needs of our work drive so many of our choices. Often I'd be looking a lot at concept art tutorials and they'd say, here are the compositional things you need to do, because so often in concept art, what we're trying to do is make really impressive images, right? Really show these things, showcase these kind of iconic set piece bits and pieces, and it's always about impact and impressing people, because that's kind of what we need to do when we're doing concept art. We need to sell the idea. In comics, though, I think often it can be more subtle, right? And I'd find that, again, not every shot needs to be this epic shot. It's almost like then your movie becomes like a Michael Bay movie, right? Like a Transformers movie, where every single shot is this kind of thing. And you don't have the highs and lows, and so much of subtlety of narrative and storytelling, again, because we need to use all the tools we can get. You might not be able to draw all those cool shots, but we can still manipulate the way people feel when they're looking at our images by using composition. And anyway, I think this is a really, really fun idea, and it's something that I think hopefully should be able to help you at any stage of your artistic journey. Anyway, let's jump over to the drawing table and I'll show you what I mean. And here we are at the drawing table. So we're going to explore the ideas of emotion and also using simple iconic set pieces to sort of serve as a way to understand how we create backgrounds and how you can use very simple ideas to manipulate the emotion that the panel or the illustration has. And I think this is something we can see at play in some of these comic book panels that I've got here as examples from the Star Atlas core comic that I drew. But also, I'll do a little bit of sketching to explain it. But if you've seen previous videos, I go into this idea of using and thinking about yourself a little bit more as a director. And this is where we have simple little items. In the case of Mondra 7, this space station, we have these clamshell style shapes. We have big towers, we have areas of foliage, we have this big canopy. And what we're trying to do is say, well, look, how do I place those? How do I combine those? How do I use those to get the right emotion across for my scene? And how do I also, show depth and make it look cool? But initially, again, it's important to understand that often what we're dealing with is a series of choices when we're creating frames. So if we think about breaking this down and looking at the options that we might have, if I have a simple frame like this, the story here is that they are discussing the fact that they have kind of failed at their task, at their mission. Their job is done, they need to forget it, and she doesn't want to forget it, and he is kind of being the pragmatist. This follows on from another panel. So we want to do a few things. We need to, and this is where what I describe as the narrative burden is often something we really need to consider in the beginning of an illustration. What do we need to carry with this illustration? What does it need to serve? And when you're dealing with comics, it often has things that it needs to lead into and things that it needs to clarify from previous panels. So it serves as both a way to tell the story that these characters are positioned here, they still are here. I'm using the body language to make them feel a bit dejected. And we also get this feeling of emptiness that's here, that is what we're really going to talk about. But I also just need to establish the scene because this is one of the first panels and pages from the comic. So this is often what's happening, is we have multiple masters that we need to serve with a single illustration. And our job is to kind of work our way through it and figure out what is the right choice to make, essentially. So in this case, what I'm going to do is really talk to the emotional side of the choices that we make. I may make some other videos talking about other considerations, but here it really is just going to be all about the emotions. So let's explore that idea a little bit more. Now, if we consider the basic compositional idea here, I have two characters talking. And that really is what I need to include. So normally when I'm beginning and when I try and teach this stuff, I really think about just very basic occupation of space, right? Where are the characters and what space are they taking up within the frame? So here, again, even though the characters may eventually be posed differently, and I will consider the pose and that will help me tell the story, I kind of want the story and the emotion to have some anchor within the frame. It's not necessarily that I'm thinking of this in the beginning, but often I have an image in my head and a lot of these decisions are sort of influenced by that feeling. And I think that's often how it happens. So we don't have to be that analytical, but as I'm describing it, I'm going to sort of break these down and simplify these forms. So I'm just going to basically say I have characters in the foreground. And what I have above them is a simple dialogue balloon. And the reason for this is I just kind of want to establish the scene and have a simple dialogue, because that follows on from the previous panel where they were sort of talking, but you didn't see who was talking. So we have two characters. Now, the question is often at this instance, what do I do next? How do I add stuff? And I think this particular sort of part of the process can be mystical, because in the beginning, when I was doing this, I'd think about, hey, what would be there? We can kind of think about ourselves as a director where you're, sitting there moving around with a camera. And I think that's a good frame of reference. And I've talked about how important it is to think of yourself as a director. But when you're illustrating, you don't necessarily need to be restricted by the camera in the same way, because we can create whatever we want. The question is, why do we make particular choices, and how do these particular choices influence the emotion? So in this instance, I have two characters here and I've placed them in this instance because, again, that's kind of what is in my head. I could equally have placed them and made them quite large in the frame. And they could still be sitting on the same kind of thing. You could essentially view this as them being zoomed up. Why would we make one choice versus another choice? I guess that's the fundamental question here. And also, if we look at potentially drawing the same thing again, if I have exactly the same idea, right? I have some foreground elements, I've got some characters here, right? Super basic, but this is the thinking process. And, you know, it is very much worthwhile as an artist doing really dumb, awful sketches like this just to get your head around, like, what space are these things taking up? But anyway, I digress. So what I've gone for with this is viewing this sort of barrel of the space station. And if we just check that out, I'll just sort of, for context, show you what that looks like. So here we have the general idea. We have the space station, and it is this cylindrical form, this tubular form, and we have the canopy overhead and this kind of little metropolis-style protopian environment in the middle. And it kind of forms this sort of arc over top, and again, like a bowl underneath, and there's kind of stuff sort of plastered all over the place. So this is the general idea that we're working with. Now, I guess the first question is like, well, which way are we looking at it from? Are we looking down this way, or are we looking that way? So I could easily frame it in this direction as well, but in this case, I kind of went for this general compositional look. Now, this is where often, again, in the beginning, I would worry about, in the beginning of my artistic journey, I would often worry about, like, well, what is the correct angle to put this from? What is the correct angle to place the camera at, and where would the perspective be? But the thing with illustration is that often we do get to control so much of it, and really what I find is that the decision of what angle to place this on can be done compositionally. So we could put this and use a really wide angle, so like a really sort of steep angle for this, and all that's doing is defining where this line is, and that to a certain degree defines the character's position to the side of the space station, and also just slightly the angle that the camera would be tilted. But either way, I'm going to make the decision of where that goes, mostly just based on composition. Where do I want this line to be? How much of this canopy do I want to see up above? And again, I also am thinking about the idea that I have this character from a story perspective who is kind of grounded, and this character he kind of is like, look, give it up. We're staying here on the station, just forget about it. And she's kind of stuck out in the middle a little bit more, sort of on her own. So anchoring him with this works. And frankly, it just kind of gives a little bit of an anchor to the side of the page anyway. And what that means is our eye in Western tradition goes from left to right. So I'm going to be going kind of here, and I just want something here to kind of transition and point back to this character. But there's also other elements where I think typically what's happening is that if we allow ourselves to flow with the natural decisions that we make, what you tend to find is we're often able to inject subtext and emotion through the drawing, and you might not even know why this is happening. But this is why it's important to think about the sequence that you make decisions and how this will influence the emotion of the scene. So again, in this instance, I am using this idea of like, he's kind of anchored to the environment. She's kind of sitting out here in the middle of nowhere. Now, what you kind of find is that, again, there would be other ways to do this, and this might be a better way. I might think, hey, I'm going to have this line go this way, and that means we're kind of looking from the opposite angle. I'm going to have this character Again, you could have either character either way, but a lot of it just depends on, again, like where do you feel like the character is best positioned in the frame. But I could have, again, the character, the female character seated here, and I'll use this big long line here to kind of point to her, right? So now we get a very sort of dynamic movement line here. Again, we could put a bunch of other iconic shapes here, and all I'm doing, again, going back to this idea, is thinking about what is the narrative, what do I need to have, and then how do I kind of fill the frame and use these abstract shapes that I know are going to be in the environment to kind of help me. And again, I can place any of them. I just can't place a big block or a square because that doesn't really fit with the visual iconography of the station. It's more about these kind of curvy shapes. So I can have this curvy shape, and in this case, this would be an arc going this way. Now, again, is there a right or a wrong here? I don't know, but I could have the same sort of position of the characters, but maybe they're both stuck out in the middle. Maybe they're both sitting on some seats, and they're kind of in the middle of this public kind of mall type area. Again, we've got some characters in the background. Right. You can still have your spaceships or whatever. Again, I don't have any anchoring, tower here. You might be able to put one here just so that this line doesn't go like bang, straight off the page. That can be a danger if we're just going straight off the page into nowhere. So, let's put a small tower. Again, it might be big, but it's just in the distance. And again, tell the story of depth with some of these other objects. Again, totally legit. I can have the same spaceships flying across. Again, the thing is that it's just going to slightly alter the feeling here, whereas I think often the decisions that were made create a couple of interesting things. Firstly, again, as I said, it anchors and makes this character feel like they're more part of the structure. This character feels on their own. But also what we could say is that, look, there's probably better ways to show the depth and make this feel really like an epic shot. There's an awkwardness to this shot here, where there's kind of this empty space here, and it feels a little bit like there is a tension to the composition here because it's just kind of weird empty space. So often when we're taught about composition, you might be trying to optimize for basic compositional rules like let's show dynamism or depth. And in that case, again, it probably would be better to tell the story of depth and, maybe have, right, like one character here, right, one character here, and really sort of play into this depth. Right, we could have one character sitting here, one character sitting there. They could still have some table behind them, right? And then we could really be looking right in here. And I could say, hey, let's just put our little dialogue balloon here, right? Because that gives me all this space to, again, maybe I could create some sort of epic shot here, right? Boom. Create cool dynamic shot. Characters just sort of talking, and I could have a whole bunch of aliens over here walking around, right? Again, I could play with, I probably wouldn't want to do that because that's going to overlap my depth here, but could have some cool depth showing like characters getting smaller as they recede into the distance, right? Have different people walking past. Again, if you look at some of the shots that have been created, in some places I sort of have done that, right? I've played with that depth and that dynamism for some shots. But what we always want to pay attention to is what is the narrative? What is the story that we're trying to tell? And I think this not only allows us to, tell better stories, but it also serves as a way to make decisions. And I think that's often where it's so important, especially early on, to know kind of what you should be doing. But as I said, we could really push this as this is the foreground. All right, I've got my characters kind of sitting here. And then, yeah, got all this other stuff in the background. And we got this kind of epic sort of thing in the background there. I could still have my ships flying around, right? Could still have some awesome shapes in the midground. So it would be possible to make this shot feel more dynamic. But what I was trying to do with this image here is think about how the characters are placed in the environment and how that makes the shot feel. So the composition maybe not necessarily being quite so optimized for depth, maybe not being the most dynamic, and having an awkwardness to it actually helps. And I think you don't necessarily have to make any of these decisions and be deterministic about it, but I think having a real simple list of what to do. So this needs to do talking, it needs to establish, and have a sort of slightly forlorn, right, sense. Right, it's slightly kind of sad, defeated, maybe awkward. So just having some idea that, again, these can be represented as motion, but having these will allow you to make decisions, because so often when you're doing this, you have to optimize for specifically how the characters are feeling, and that's often a really good way to make decisions because it aids clarity. Ultimately, you could make this panel any way you wanted. As I said, you could shot it from here, right? You could have it close up. At some point, it's not just a matter of like what's better or what tells the story better, but at some point, you as the artist have to decide. You have to make a choice. You have to, put a flag in the sand, right? You have to draw your lines and say, this is what this particular shot is going to be about. This is the framing I'm going to have for it. And this is how I'm going to manipulate and use that to optimally tell the story. So I think it's something that's worth considering no matter what stage of art you're at. And it's something that I think I've used to clarify my thought process and to help me know when to make decisions. But more importantly, I think it's critical to understand that often the way we begin is just by blocking in the necessary elements of a shot. Again, here I have two characters, right? So if we think about the elements that are needed, I need two characters plus, right, my little space environment where I've got towers, I've got these archways, I've got these big clamshell things, right? So I've got my tower, right? I've got my clamshell shape, right? I've got my arc, right? These sort of arching canopy things above. And it's like, okay, how am I going to use these little tools? How am I going to arrange these set pieces to sort of tell the story? If you think about putting these in initially and then consider, again, what are my options? I think that is just a really good way to help you make decisions and be very practical. So hopefully this little idea has helped you think through this process a little bit. And again, maybe it's something you can try in your own work. I think a really good exercise here, just as a little takeaway, is to just play with this idea. Think of your little story. What is your story? Can you visualize it? How many characters, right? Is it two characters fighting plus a background? Which is the most important, right? And think about how the emotions play into that. Think about how the way that the characters feel, the story you're going to try and tell. Think about how they specifically are going to influence the way that you combine these different elements. Because again, there is an infinite number of stories you could tell with the background, right? I could just have these characters very small here, like this, right? Again, that would make it even more forlorn, right? Just make it kind of flat, right? Flat composition, just this big ovoid shape here, right? Let's not have it be super dynamic. I mean, these are all going to be good. It's not a matter of like, what will be good, what will be bad. Again, some things are going to be more dynamic than others. Some things might look cooler. But again, remember, I think the most important thing is what is the story you're trying to tell? What is the feeling you're trying to get across? And as long as you have that front and center, it will be a good North Star. All right, so I think that's all we've got time for in this one. The real takeaway here, I think, is that if you use the narrative and the story to frame a lot of your decisions, I think both makes your life a lot easier because you have some way to actually make choices, to know what to put there. It's a lot easier to avoid getting kind of sort of frozen up and unsure. It's also important to understand, as I said in the beginning, that the power we have as artists is that we can kind of warp these rules. We can kind of create whatever world we want. The more you lean into that and understand that sometimes you want to create things that look awkward because the story you're trying to tell is awkward. Sometimes you want to make things flat. Sometimes you want to create a lot of depth. There's no sort of one thing is better than others. Some things will engage the eye better. Some things will be more dynamic. Some things will feel as if you're in a real action movie, but you don't always want that. If we place narrative and storytelling at the top of our decision tree, I think it both makes our life easier, and I think it allows us to tell better stories, which, from my point of view, is the main point anyway. Anyway, hopefully this was interesting. Let me know if you got any thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll catch you on the next one.